let's take a look at the age-old question you see that I'm always getting every workshop that I do, and it's the blending. So I wanted to show a bit of a blend here to start with, okay? Um, we discussed on the Facebook live that I did yesterday evening. I know some of you were there looking at that, and we discussed in the looking at a shot from Slovenia in Lake Bled, and everything was totally still, like it was a mirror reflection. Incredible clouds, perfect light. And in that situation, when I'm doing a blend, I can automate the blend. I can go in, I can tell Lightroom or Photoshop, Camera Raw, merge to HDR, blend these files together. And because there's no movement in the shot, the clouds are not moving really. I know they're moving a little bit, but they're not moving in a visible way. Everything lines up when we automate the blend together. Everything fits together like a glove onto your hand. Okay. But when we're shooting shots and we're trying to blend um, in a situation like this in Fannet Head, okay, you can see that. Look at the texture of the water here. This is a slower exposure. And look at the texture of the water here. This is a quicker exposure, okay? So one of these, this has a 10 stop on it. This, I can't remember, maybe a 6 stop, something like that, okay? And then here's my darker shot, which has the sky. Now, in this darker shot, the water texture is totally different down the bottom. Absolutely and totally and utterly different. So when I'm shooting water, what I tend to do is get a few shots of the water with different textures. Like I lock in on the composition that I like, and then I might shoot some at 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 30 seconds. I'll gather often a range of shutter speeds with water that I like so I can decide afterwards. And then I'll also get a sky. So I have a range of shots for the foreground and I have a sky, and then afterwards I can decide what water texture I like best. The problem, of course, is that the texture of the water in the sky shot is always totally different to the foreground shots because we have to shoot a much quicker exposure to get the texture, to get the darker shot of the sky. Now, I know there is other ways. Of course, you could probably get the exact same texture if you changed ISO, or if you opened aperture, and you could manipulate the shutter speed that way. But personally, I like to keep the aperture consistent there. I like to keep the ISO down nice and low. So my shutter speed is the one that I'm going to need to adjust. And in those circumstances, when I adjust shutter speed, I'm going to have a different texture in the water in the darker shot than I am in the brighter shots. And we can just open these files up for a second. Excuse me. And even if I make this brighter in the foreground, look how different the water texture is in that shot to this shot and this shot. Okay. So what that means is that if we try to do an auto blend, okay, and we just hit the merge to HDR, it's going to create a mess for us. Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever is going to try and layer the files on top of each other, and it's going to create messy textures and funny discolorations and things like that. So in this situation, I personally will always try. I'm just going to cancel out of there. I personally will always use a manual blend. I'm going to pull these guys into Lightroom for a second, and we'll start off in Lightroom. Does anybody have any questions about that? About the technique of shooting images in the field like that and gathering the ingredients to do the work afterwards with. It's okay. Just Lightroom is loading. Just gives me a chance to do some drinking. Okay. So here's our longer exposure. Who prefers the longer one and who prefers the one with a bit more detail? We got any votes there? I can see some of you. Give me a hands up for the longer exposure. Dan, Michael's on the longer one. Anyone prefer the shorter one with a bit more detail in the water?
Longer exposure for me, Peter.
Longer for Paul. Well, Paul, that was never in doubt, mate. That was never in doubt. My long exposure brother.
Longer for me.
Longer as well for me, Peter.
Longer. A lot of people going longer. Fiona going
Going
longer.
longer.
Longer. Anyone going faster? I think some people like it. They just They're just keeping quiet. I do like the slightly faster one here in that it does show a bit of the it's not fast, it's definitely not fast. Let's see what Lightroom tells us. It was like half a second, okay, versus in here, which is 5 seconds. Okay, so not super long either, but definitely creates that smoothness. Okay, so I feel like the overwhelming feeling is that we need to go with the longer exposure then for the blend. Okay, so here's the thing about the blend. The great thing about what we're going to do next is that control of texture that I talked about. We have to make no compromise on our foreground texture with this technique. Okay, we're going to keep exactly that water and exactly that texture. I mean, look, sometimes it might be worth, let's say, grabbing this one. Okay, and grabbing a second shot. If I'm going to try and take a punt, let's call it, on a shot like this, I won't try and merge 5 or 6 files together. I might just grab a sky and grab a foreground. And there is a possibility that Lightroom will have the brains to figure it out. Just merge the HDR. Let's just see how it does. I really hope it makes an absolute bollocks of this because it would make what I'm about to show you next seem more important. Oh, but it hasn't. It's done it perfectly. To be fair, it has figured it out there quite nicely. Jesus, I should just give up. I should definitely just give up. It has done it absolutely perfectly. It's maintained the texture. I shouldn't have even done that. I'm going to make myself look really bad now. Um, let's just bring this to fruition and let's take a proper look at it and see what it's done. Come on, I want to see some real disfiguration in here somewhere. No, it looks pretty good, honestly. It's figured out that we just want that foreground. No, there it is. Look, there's some weirdness. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank God it's messed it up somehow. That is bizarre looking, this little pool of golden light here, okay? So, honestly, it did a better job than I thought it would, and we could clone this out. We could of course clone this out, and it's a minor thing, but in general, I find that technique with moving water can often cause a problem, in terms of the textures in the foreground. So I'd rather have a method that I feel is foolproof, that's going to work every time. So we're going to take this guy and we're going to try and bring this one onto it. So here's the big trick about doing manual blending, okay? It's really important at the outset to try and somewhat match the brightness levels of both files. It'll make the blend much, much easier if you have some kind of synergy between the files, or you have at least a thought process of how the files are going to look together. Because, if we take this shot here, for example, and we go, well, that I like how that makes my foreground look, okay? And then we take this shot here and we go, well, I like how it makes my sky look. It's lovely dark and moody there. If we try and throw this sky on this foreground, it simply won't match properly. Okay, so it's important at the outset to try and get a little bit of a feeling that they're going to match a little bit better. And I'm just hitting Command Z there just to bring me back to the original. Whoops, that's not working. Hit reset just to bring me back to the original luminance values of those files. Okay, so with the bright one here, for example, what that means to me in terms of making sure they match is I don't want to overly brighten this. Okay, I do want to catch there's a little bit of detail missing here. So I'm going to just put a radial on there and I'm just going to open the shadows there. So if I was to describe what I'm trying to do now, as I said, it's trying to match it. It's carrying out adjustments which I want to do in RAW. Like I want to open the shadows in RAW in terms of the noise and the grain. I want to carry out white balance adjustments in RAW. But I personally feel when I'm doing a blend like this that I can't shape the image until I blend it together. Okay, so I can't really get that directional shape into the picture, which is the most important thing you do in your post-processing, until I bring the elements together. Now, that's just me. Some people will say, well, we should have done more in RAW. We could have done this, we could have done that. And look, I can't argue if people can create directional shape in two separate pictures and then bring them together and they match great, then fair play to you. But I personally can't do that. I just need it to be together before I can really shape it. Okay. At the same time, I want to get a little bit of match in the luminance values as I discussed, but I also want to kind of fix a few of the little niggly little problems that are potentially in either file before I go out, because once I blend them together, it's not going to be a raw file anymore. Okay, so I want to fix a few of those little niggly problems that I have here at the outset. So something like, the shadows being blocked up there, you see? Just bringing like a little bit of detail out of the shadows there. I would say also down here, we definitely have some shadows all blocked up down there as well. It's more blocky as we go into this left side. We get a little bit out of there. And we get a little bit out of here. Something like that. Okay, so now I've got some, it's not, I don't know how it's appearing on Zoom, but on my screen it's dark, but it's certainly not black. Okay, there is some detail in there. Okay. What I'm actually going to do with this is I'm also going to create a mask of the sky. So this is going to actually bring back a lot of the sky because a lot of the detail is already there in the sky. And I'm going to pull down the highlights in the sky. And then what I'm going to do also with it, I'm not going to actually darken it too much more because I don't want to affect the lighthouse. But I am going to try and again, look, get that synergy. Now we know this part of the shot is fecked here. That's burnt out. That ain't coming back. For all our Irish participants, when all the last sunshine is gone, it's really gone. It's like the half-price tiles. It's one of those ads that revolves on Dublin radio. So when all the highlights are gone, they're really gone. Like they're not going to come back if they're burnt out properly. Okay, but we know we've got those details here, right? So let's try and get some synergy here so they'll blend a little bit better. So I'm going to grab the sky here. And I'm actually going to brighten the sky a little bit. Okay, I'll pull the highlights down in it to bring that little bit back, okay? Let's just jump back to our other image and see how that looks. Okay, it looks pretty bad, the transition zone here, but I'm just looking at the kind of luminance of this sky and the other sky. They don't look far out, okay? If I don't look at the foreground here, this is of course super dark. So I'm going to select, or I'm going to duplicate and invert the mask. I selected the sky. Now I'm going to duplicate and invert the mask. And just bear in mind that this is the easy image that we're going to do tonight. I'm going to open the shadows a little bit. And I'm going to open the exposure in a little bit. And again, that looks awfully horrible and looks really HDR, the whole look of that picture. But, we now have some, again, balance in terms of the lighting between the two shots. Make it easier to blend it, okay? I hate how this steppiness looks here, so I'm just going to turn that on and off again. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit a subtract. I'm going to get a radial, and I'm just going to subtract a little bit away there, just to make that a little bit more natural in that area. Okay, so here's our two files. So if we think about that with the blend, it's the prep is really important for the two files to try and match somewhat before you bring them in together. Now, once I have the two, I just hold down Command. I've got the two files there, and I right click and I go edit in. And what I'm going to do with them is you can either open them up as smart object layers in Photoshop, or you can just open them up as straight layers in Photoshop, okay? Will I open them up as smart objects? I will. But you can, if you're not used to what smart objects are, just open them as layers in Photoshop, okay? I'll show you the reason why I want to use the smart objects here as well. Definitely a wine break. Okay, so we've got our two files here. We've got our lighter one is actually on the top layer and our darker one is underneath. and they're not even lighter or darker because I've kind of balanced them. Our foreground file, which has this slow exposure, is on top, and our file, which has more detail in the sky, is below it. Okay. Um, it doesn't actually really matter the order in which you do these things, but my preference is to have the foreground file on the bottom, okay, and then build things on top of that. It seems more logical to me personally to have the foreground, the bottom, bring in elements on top of the foreground. That requires you to use black masks rather than white masks. Okay, I'm going to show you how to do that now. So I'm just going to pull this guy down the bottom. Okay, so my foreground file is on the bottom, but now we're just seeing the sky file. I'm going to turn the eye off. Okay, so now we can see the foreground file. Okay, so how I tend to do it is I go on to the file above. This is the sky file. I add a layer mask down here, and then I hit Command I. Oops, Command I or invert. I can't remember where it is. Where is invert? Surely, maybe because I just inverted it already. Where is invert? It should be
Then select.
select. Somebody's helping me. Somebody's keeping on me. It's that Rebecca.
Yes.
How are you?
Great.
I think it's under layers.
Adjustment invert. There it is. There it is. Image adjustments of invert. If you want to do it from the top level navigation, but Command I is I'm just so used to doing it that way. So that's turned the white mask into a black mask. Okay, and once that's done, because it's a black mask, and you need to watch my video on how all this works. If this is gobbledygook to you, the black mask hides this file here, which is our sky file, and we're just seeing the underneath file then. Okay, so how I would typically do this is I would come in here and I would do select sky. Okay, and then once I have the sky selected, I would grab the gradient, which is the gradient tool over here on the left, and I need to make sure I have a white gradient. And for some reason, I think that's set up wrong. That's the opacity is there. Let me just test this. No, that's good. Okay, so I need to have a white gradient. I need to make sure up here, this is going from black to white for the gradient to work properly. And I need to make sure the opacity is up at 100%. So these are little points of order with this type of work that you screw one of them up and you just go into a hole with it. And you're like, why the effing hell won't that work? Like, I've been at this thing all bloody day, and it can just be as simple as, making sure that the layer mask is selected. You're on this part of it and you don't even realize, and you're like, why isn't it coming in? Why is everything going black? Like, I just can't figure it out. And you could spend days just not realizing it's that. You just got to be on that, and you got to be on white here, and you got to have this coming from black to white, or it won't work. Okay. So once I have all that in place, then I can pull the gradient down. Oops. That hasn't come in the way I wanted it to. Why is that? Something is not happening. Hold on, let me fix this. After just giving you the whole pep talk, maybe I have this the wrong way around. Something very odd happening. Sorry, guys. Go back a step here. Okay. That's the sky. Layer mask. Hide it. Gradient. White. Okay, I've got this the wrong way around clearly. Operator error. Maybe it's just not quite strong enough. Let's just go with a brush. That gradient's brought it initially in, and there we go. Okay. There it is. So you can see it now. It's having it was so similar. I wasn't seeing it come in with the gradient. It was very light, and then I had to brush over it a little bit more to bring it in. So you can see we've got the other sky in now. You can see there's detail there, there's detail here. I'm going to do that again because that wasn't a very fluid, clear presentation of what was happening. Okay, so I'm going to add the layer mask, make it on white. I'm going to Command I to invert it. Okay, I'm going to get my gradient. I'm going to make sure I'm on white to black here. I'm going to pull it down, and it's going to subtly bring in the new sky. Okay, if I feel with my gradient that I haven't got all of the sky in because the gradient is feathered, I'm then going to take a brush at a low enough opacity, maybe about 30%, and just brush over there a little bit more. Okay, so that has now changed the sky. Okay, I still feel like with this sky that we have like a little bit of burnout there. Okay, so is that a case that the file was not prepared properly? Potentially, I could have maybe tried to darken in there a little bit more to get the detail into that area. But honestly, my thinking with it was that if I try to excessively darken that area in Lightroom, it's very difficult to get detail into that area without really screwing up, making that whole area look all smudgy and odd. Okay, so what I would prefer to do is use my smart objects, and that's why I brought it in as smart objects with layers. So what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to right click on this guy, and I'm going to hit new smart object via copy. That's going to essentially make a duplicate of that file. Okay, and I'm going to unlink the mask and just throw that away. So we're back to the start. We have this texture in the foreground that we don't want, but we have a reasonable sky, but just with a little bit of blowout in an area that we're not totally happy with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this guy, because I have a smart object, I can bring it back into Camera Raw, and I'm just going to darken it down a little bit. And that's going to bring some more of the detail back into this area where we want to see it. And then I'm going to click OK. And this is what I was talking about at the outset, was I like to have this foreground down the bottom. Then I like to put the thing on top of it that I want to add and hit it with a black mask to hide it, then bring it in. So that's what I've done here. I've got the bit that I want to bring in, I've put it on the top, and then I'm just going to make sure there's no active selection. Yeah, nothing to deselect. Then I'm going to add the layer mask, and I'm going to hit Command I to hide it. So now that bit of detail is hidden in there again. And I want to just bring a little bit of it into the sky area, and I'm going to do that with the luminosity mask. So I'm going to load my lights masks, and I'm going to get like lights 3. That's really selecting these bright areas in here. And I'm going to load that lights mask as a selection on here, and with my brush on white, because I have a black mask, and with my black mask selected and a low opacity, I'm just going to try and bring a little bit more detail out of there. And there we go. That's just brought that area down a little bit. Okay, so I know that the image is by no means finished there, but what we have done is we have fixed the sky, right? Okay, and then from there we can actually start editing. So when we're doing those blends, get that match right, as I said in Lightroom, try and follow those steps with the layers, and then once you have it that done, what I typically actually do is I just go layer and I flatten the picture, and then I start the edit. Now, for you, that might be hit Command Save and bring it back into Lightroom and do the edit in Lightroom. For me, that's normally going into Camera Raw. I'm just going to get rid of this bit down the bottom. There we go. Okay, so now I'll just go Filter and Camera Raw Filter. And I'll do something like get a curve, lift up the blacks, darken it down, really try and bring an atmospheric mood into this image. Take a radial, throw it on the bank. Let's lift that up a little bit. Let's make it warm. Give that feeling like the light is really falling on that bank right there, you know? We can just do something simple then, like lift the shadows up a little bit, pull the highlights down a little bit. Operator error, there we go, there's the clarity. Add a little bit of clarity to it. And that's they're very simple adjustments that I've just carried out, but it definitely requires getting the sky in at the outset, for that to really work. And if we just give it a little bit of a lift, a little bit of color, and we click OK, and we hit Command Save, which should allow us to compare things back in Lightroom. And we've gone from there, or there, let's say, to there. So the first really complicated bit was getting that blend done well. And if you found that like really, really complicated doing that blending, try it in Lightroom first. try and just like do that merge to HDR like I did at the start and nearly got totally caught out. But if you're going to do that merge to HDR, I know often when we're doing the workshops, I'm saying to you is, get 7 or 8 files at one stop apart and then just bring them all together in post and hit merge to HDR and start to work on the files that way. But when you're dealing with a textural issue, like as in the water texture is so different in all those files, do not try and merge 7 of them together. Just try and merge one that has a decent foreground and one that has a decent sky and see do you get away with it. And I do think we would have got away with it tonight. The background here, do you see how much more natural our line is? But, that's a pretty small detail for all that work, isn't it? But, honestly, it won't figure it out as well as it did most of the time. As we saw in that example, it just won't. That's my experience of it. Potentially, it's getting better, and it's getting smarter, and that is also true. It is getting better and smarter. But I think that 2-file idea is sort of a mitigating one that might help there. So, any questions about that before we do the actually complicated thing? No? Okay, well, hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into manual blending, guys. And you can see as well, like one thing it definitely, would say with that is that, it's something like we've sometimes talked about with the auto settings in the auto blend as well. It's like that when you do the auto blend and then you allow the auto settings in, you get this instant result where it just puts everything together and goes ping, what it also creates a lot of problems along the way when it's doing that. So if you're trying this method, don't get disheartened if, for want of a more articulate description, your picture looks like shite after you've blended it, because you're just trying to get the kind of constituent parts in place, which you can then work the shaping and the color and all that stuff for the picture. Once you have the right stuff in the right places, then you can kind of work from there, And I think you could see that very clearly. It didn't look good, the picture, when I blended it together. It was still looking a bit messy and not looking like, but I think with that quick edit, then it looks really good, And you could have it with this texture, or we could have done it with a totally different texture there. Lots of people still coming in. Okay. So let's look at the actually complicated one then. So I was honestly super pleased with this edit this year. It was good bit of work, as I said, to get it right, but I was very pleased personally with the final result. So what I have is I have the raw file here, and I have a TIFF file as well, which I've saved some of the masks on, so I'm able to show you the whole kind of process of what I was able to do to get that file there, you know. So it doesn't matter if you start off in Camera or Lightroom. I think way more people are using Lightroom, so I'm going to pull the file into Lightroom to start. I may have already had this file in Lightroom. No, I didn't. I did it in Camera Raw. So I'll start in Lightroom, as I said, just so more people are comfortable. Okay, so as I was looking at this file and I was starting out the edit, I was doing things like I was trying to, darken it, lift the curves, darken it there, and we'll definitely be able to get it some way. I do stuff like I get the color range mask. I try and grab some of those yellows there and just refine that back a little bit and warm them up and lift them up. And I think that does a pretty good job. And definitely, if I was saying this last night, if you have those autumn files from the last couple of months, making that color range selection on the yellows is a lovely way to work things, to just lift the yellows in one of your scenes. So that's working okay so far. Bring down the linear gradient though now and intersect it with the sky mask. Excuse me. So even though this does come down and does get you some way there in terms of the look of the picture that we're trying to achieve, for me, I just couldn't. You can see all the haloing that's happening up here. So the quality of the mask that you have is also a reflection of the strength of the adjustment that you want to carry out. And what I mean by that is that, the more aggressive you want to be in terms of the adjustment, as in how much you want to darken the sky versus how light the mountain is. If you just want to tweak it a little bit, you don't need a great mask. It won't be noticeable. But if you want to be aggressive in the transition zone, then you need a really good mask. And typically, Lightroom and Camera Raw does not make masks that are good enough to work aggressively in transition zones. That is a fact, I would say. It just simply does not make good enough masks to work aggressively in transition zones. Now, you might not want to work aggressively in transition zones. You might, find that the whole process of really getting in depth to this is not worthwhile. It's not a worthwhile expenditure of your brain, of your time, and because you can, as you can see clearly, with just a quick couple of edits on this, we can get to a pretty good place. We can definitely get to a pretty good place if I reset it. Look where we were and where we got to, but I'm just not sure if we can get to here. And we could get further. We could get further than this in Lightroom than I am here, but I don't think we can. I don't think we can get to here. So for me, when I was trying to do that, what I decided was that I would essentially ignore the sky in here. Okay, so I just did some adjustments, something similar to what you're seeing now. Oops. Something like this. And I decided that I would deal with the sky in Photoshop. Okay, so to do that, I wanted to bring it in as a smart object again. Okay, so I right click on it and I edit in and I open as a smart object. Here we go. Open, open, open. Okay. So if you remember how the smart object works, what that does is it allows us essentially it allows us access back into RAW which allows us to create multiple versions of same set file, like a lighter one, a darker one, some with different white balances, things like that. I'm not sure who's unmuted, but there's sometimes some sounds coming through. So if you wouldn't mind, if you're not muted, just make sure. Actually, you all look like you're muted on the screen in front of me. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure who the culprit is. So there's no finger pointing, but it is good from everyone's point of view if we can be muted for this. Unmute and ask me any questions if you want, but just while I'm editing, it'd be great. So we have it as a smart object. If we open this smart object, we click down here in the right corner, it brings it back to raw. Okay. But we can also make multiple versions, as I said. Now, what you should be careful with using this is that you do not just duplicate the layer. Okay. If you duplicate the layer like I just did there, I pulled it in to create a new layer, or you right click on it and hit duplicate. There we go, duplicate layer. This method will not work, because if you just duplicate it and then you open the top one, if you darken it, okay, it'll apply those changes to both layers. Okay, so you don't want to just duplicate it. Just going to go back a couple of steps. What you need to do is right click on it and hit new smart object via copy. Okay, that will create a different version of it. New smart object via copy. But then when I open up this guy and I apply some changes, let's say I want to get more warmth in here. I'm going to lighten that a little bit. And I'm going to bring some warmth into that area and click OK. Now you see they're working independently. So now I have two files with two different looks to them, let's say. Okay. So with the yellows, here's a good point. Okay. So what I did with the yellows is, again, remember I have my base layer down the bottom is how I primarily work. Then I pop the thing I want to bring in on top of the base layer. Okay. The foreground, the primary contents of my image is at the bottom. And then I add a layer mask and I click Command I and I invert it. Okay, so now that has hidden this very yellow shot below my base one. So now what I want to do is I want to bring in the yellows just in here on the trees. There's various ways we can do that. We could do it a real simple way. We could just take a brush, make sure our brush is on white because we have a black mask. Let's turn our opacity up to about 40% and we just start to brush in that yellow. And in it comes. Okay. But you see how it spills out up here? Keep an eye on that. And it's not really noticeable. It wouldn't be that big a deal, honestly. But what I would rather do is to have a mask in place which protects that area. Okay. There's various ways we can do it. The simplest way to do it is you can use the color range up here. Click on color range. Select these yellows. Hold down Shift will allow you to select multiple points to get a wider selection. Can you see that getting a little bit wider? Something like that. Click OK. I mustn't have had it set up to load as a selection because I don't think it didn't load as a selection there. Let me try again. I don't normally do it this way. I was trying to show you the simple way and I'm making it more complicated. Color range. Selection preview. Maybe it won't let me load as a selection because I am on a layer mask. Let's try that. Save it. Let's save it. Okay, we can hit save. No. Thought it would save it as a channel. I'm not sure why it won't load it as a selection. It says selection is loaded there, but when we click OK, it loads it as a selection. It was because I was on the the layer mask and not the layer. So now we have a mask which selects the yellows. Hit Command H, it hides it. So now when we brush over it and bring in those yellows, okay, and we turn that on and off, you see it no longer spills in there because that color range selection was in place. What I honestly normally do is I use my TK panel and I get the color dropper and I select the yellow here. I click OK, and I'll probably expand that mask a little bit, something like that. And then I'll load that as a selection. and then I can just brush in those yellows. So that is a very common technique for me for post-processing of double post-processing the smart object. Because what that allows me to do, as you can see, is create two different versions of the same raw file and blend them together with the control of the masking of Photoshop. Because we started off this conversation by saying that the masking in Lightroom, while it is fantastic and it can get you a lot of the way there, when the shit really hits the fan, it's not as good. It's just not as good, you know. Um, and this was an easy enough one to do. We probably could have done this in Lightroom with the color range masks anyway. Okay. But this sky is an issue. Sky is definitely an issue. So the only way I know anyway to create a mask when you have no color separation and no contrast separation, and to really create an accurate mask is to use the pen tool. Okay, and the pen tool is down here on the left-hand side. It's above the text. You can see it there, the pen tool. Okay, and how this works is that you zoom in to about 200%, maybe even 400%. Okay, and you start like this. And you get about 4 bottles of wine in, get close to finishing. Okay, and you draw these little lines all the way around. Okay, and honestly, this mask took me about 20 minutes to make. Okay, to make the mask of the sky, and you just follow the edge, and you don't go too much space between these. Yeah, 20, maybe 30 minutes to make this mask. And I'm not going to do that now, clearly, because I'm like one of those guys on the food channel. Here's one we made earlier. So I'll just go along there though, just to demonstrate. Okay. So let's say now, let's imagine, okay, that I was in at 400% and I went all the way along, really accurate, all the way here, and this doesn't look like crap, okay? And I'm really drunk by the end of it because I've had 4 bottles of wine. It's taken me so long to get here. Okay. And I just get to the end and I'm in here and I'm like, thank effing God this is over. And I get to here. Okay. And what you have to do then is you have to join the path. It's called a path that we're creating. You have to join the path together. Okay. So normally how I do that is I go outside the image, because it makes sure that I get all of the sky at the top. And then I just click there, and that's joined the path together. Okay. Once I've joined the path together, I then right click on it and I hit make selection. Okay. And that makes a selection. Okay. So this will pop up, make selection, and it will give you a feathering radius. I normally feather by 0.5. Okay. And I click OK. And that's actually selected the bottom area. So I go down into my channels palette and I hit save. You can see I have the foreground there. Okay. Then I right click on it and I select the inverse and I hit save. And then I have a mask for my sky and a mask for my foreground. Okay. Then I can work now with that mask. I can work aggressively in the transition zone. Okay. So here's the one we prepared earlier. So here's my TIFF file. I'm just going to turn off all these layers. Okay, and I've done like a bit of preparatory work in Camera Raw with this file, okay? And then before I've tried to blend anything in, I've gone all the way tick, 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 tick around this, okay? Now, this was a big mask to create with this technique, okay? You might sometimes just say, well, I just want to lighten just the tip of this mountain. Okay, you've just got a smaller area that you want to deal with. And again, with that pen tool, where is it? You could go in and, just tick, 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 and just get this little top area and then bring the path down here and close it. And then you can just work in the transition zone and then just a little small tip. So you don't necessarily need to create the mask of the whole thing, but it is very useful when you have it, because now what I can do, you see, if I go in and look at my channels, you see there's my foreground and there's my sky. Okay. Now if I just, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, how am I going to do this? I'm going to delete these because I'm not 100% sure what I did with them. So here's the dark file. Look, darker and bluer. Okay. So I want to bring that dark blueness into the sky. So I'm working with my primary file underneath. I'm putting my next little element I want to introduce on top of my primary file. I'm making sure there's no active selection. And I'm adding a layer mask. And then I'm inverting it so it's hiding it. Okay. I'm then going into my channels palette where I've had the selection that's eventually turned me to alcoholism saved and ready to go. And I'm hitting Command and loading Alpha 2. Okay, which we could name as sky and foreground if we were more organized than me. Okay, so I've just loaded that sky mask. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my gradient. I'm going to put it on white. Oh, you see, this was black to white. It should have been white to black. These are the things that can trip you up. And now I can bring in the sky and start to get a really nice separation. Now, I would say, I'm just actually going to get rid of these. Oops. So once I have that mask, okay, it means that I can continue to be aggressive in that transition zone. So, with the tops of the mountains here, for example, I can load the foreground like so. And then I have this dodge and burn in my TK panel area. This is burn and this is dodge. And I'm just going to load a dodge layer. And with a opacity of about 10%, I'm just going to brush the tops of these mountains. And because I have that great mask in there, I can easily lighten just the top of the mountains without it spilling over into the sky. And I know that that would require, or does require, more, toing and froing between here and there to get it to here. But the basis of what I demonstrated there is how you get to that point. So sometimes, for example, with that pen tool thing, I would, you'd struggle to get this lighthouse here nice and bright. It'd be nice if that lighthouse was a bit brighter, isn't it? But it's really hard to make a selection of a lighthouse. And I did the same thing when I edited my version of Fanit. I got the pen tool and I went in there and I went all along these lines. And this one probably took me about 10 minutes. I didn't worry so much about the red. I just went in here, I went up here, I went across here. I separated that out individually and went all the way along and I just lightened up the lighthouse on its own just a little bit, sitting on top of the hill there. And you can probably see it if we go in here and we look at this one has a little bit of it. You can see the way the lighthouse is kind of nice and white and is a little bit brighter, even though the backlighting is coming in behind it. You can see it very clearly here. See, the White House is the lighthouse is super clean with that backdrop, and you can draw around it and hit object select, and you can try and do it with a luminosity mask. But so far, in my experience, the only way that I can really separate out those hard edge objects along the transition zone when there's a lack of contrast is with that pen tool. And it's time consuming and it's a pain in the arse, but it gets a great result.